Senator Eccles, if she wouldn't mind saying a prayer for us. Are you, what number?
6.
Number 6. Okay.
All right, let us pray. Dear God, thank you for letting us all be here today. Lord, I pray that you will use us to do your work for the people of Georgia. God, be with our farmers and our producers, Lord. I know that we've had some serious weather issues that have affected our state's crops, and I pray that you be with those farmers and those families, God, and let them understand that it's your plan, not ours. Thank you for the work we do in this committee, and thank you for the people I have the privilege of serving with. In your name I pray, amen.
Amen. All righty. Well, today we have our friends from the Georgia EPD are going to come here and I think sort of allow our committee to hear some of the same testimony that you all provided to the House Agriculture Committee. So, Mr. Cliff, I think you're going to... Cliff, just for Rachel here, do you mind telling her your full name and what you do at EPD?
Yes, my name is Cliff Lewis. I'm with the Georgia Environmental Protection Division. And specifically, I manage the...
I'm sorry. Say that. Did you get it?
Yes. Yeah. Cliff Lewis with Georgia Environmental Protection Division, specifically the Agricultural Water Withdrawal Permitting Program Manager.
Good deal.
Appreciate the opportunity to talk with the committee today. Wanted to go over some of the things that I spoke about in the House Committee, as you said, Mr. Chairman, and that gets into the permitting moratorium that we currently have on in the Flint Basin with regard to some of the surface water uses and some of the Florida and groundwater uses in that basin, and I believe some of the ARPA, the American Rescue Recovery Plan project that we're doing, and obviously we'll take any questions at any point. What the agricultural permitting program does for Georgia EPD is it permits water withdrawals for farm uses, anything over 100,000 gallons per day, or a pump size of 70 gallons per minute would require a permit. That typically comes down to farmers and golf courses for our program. And in July 30th of 2012, we had a suspension. Then Director Judd Turner implemented a suspension on agricultural water withdrawal permits in portions of the lower Flint and the Chattahoochee River basins. And specifically, as of that July 30th, 2012 date, EPD no longer considered accepting any applications for ag water withdrawal permits in that lower Flint basin. It affected applications for new permits for withdrawals from the Florida aquifer and for surface waters in the area known as, we commonly refer to as Sub-Area 4. That's the affected region where surface and groundwater interaction has been modeled extensively and shown to be essentially the same water given their close proximity to one another. But the applications for new withdrawals from the Florida aquifer are not accepted. Applications for existing permit modifications that would increase either the pump capacity on that permit or the irrigated acreage that was allowed under that permit also has not been accepted since that time. Applications for permit modifications that would increase pump capacity or irrigated acreage in Spring Creek, Itchaway, Notchway Creek, and the Kitchafoonie-Muckalee Creek subbasins of the Flint River Basin were affected, as well as the applications for new permits in those three subbasins of the Flint as well. Permitting in other parts of the Flint Basin, Chattahoochee Basin, has continued since that moratorium, and also unrestricted aquifers, such as a deeper aquifer, has been made available to those that want to use water in that basin if that aquifer was available at that location. The reason for that moratorium is because the water resources in that basin that are affected by the suspension are such a significant source of water for irrigation. The farm gate value of that region is the largest in the state. It's our breadbasket as far as agriculture goes, but continued increase in water withdrawals over time has shown that maybe there's some concern in some areas, whether it be for some species or for low flows in some of the rivers and streams and some of our downstream neighbors. Protecting existing users is something that EPD is statutorily bound to do. And so any existing user in an area that, that is being looked at for additional water withdrawals has to be considered and is considered in all of our models. So if you have a permit in that area, you have certainty in that your irrigated acreage and your pump capacity and your investments are protected. So that's something that we've had to take a look at. So it wasn't just a matter of, what's coming into the system. It's, hey, what do we have in the system and how do we manage that? And then how does that connect to what we might have in the future? But suspending the consideration of those permit applications in the area has really allowed EPD to take in a lot of new information, a lot of data over the years since that implementation, and update the tools that we use in the management of our water resources in those basins, and we continually assess the water resources in those basins and in that region to evaluate the potential for impacts. So that was the reason for the moratorium in the beginning, and it was essentially just to make sure that that being such an important area for Georgia, an important area for the water resources and for the needs of those that were already permitted, we needed time to take a look at what was out there, how it was impacting the water resources in that region, and what steps we might need to take as far as data that we need or information that we might need to consider. And so that's what's been happening since that moratorium has been implemented in July of 2012. We are still under that moratorium. When we get applications, we do not take applications for Florida aquifer withdrawal or surface. We do talk to that applicant about any potential for other water resources. We're pretty successful at doing that, although the costs have increased dramatically to move to deeper aquifers, and the Florida aquifer is the more shallow than where our alternatives are now, but we do have alternatives for those who want to get into the system to continue to get into for now. Next thing I'll talk about is the agricultural water source conversion for stream flow resilience project. That project is a partnership with the Georgia EPD, Georgia Water Planning and Policy Center, and the Golden Triangle Resource Conservation and Development Council. And the goal of this project is to increase agricultural water supply reliability and better protect the surface waters during drought periods. How this is going to happen is we're going to convert surface water withdrawals in that lower Flint Basin to deep groundwater sources, essentially taking the users off of surface water in the worst of times or in the driest of times and having them move to more reliable and less impactful on stream flows and have them move to groundwater. This is a $49.8 million award by the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, and invitations were sent out to participants who had existing surface water permits in the subbasins of the lower Flint, and offered to have a cost share program, 90% of a deep well installed for them if they would agree to conditions on their surface water permits to be modified to only to switch off of those surface water permits and move to groundwater use during times of drought. The existing surface water withdrawal permits are modified so that those drought conditions take effect. Those drought conditions, they would be notified of when those were to take place, and notified when those newly permitted groundwater sources in the deeper aquifers are to be used instead of the surface water sources. Plan to install 242 deep groundwater wells at the site of those surface water withdrawals. Can we do that or not? I mean, when we proposed this, the prices of things were not what they were today, and that was the number that we had projected. So we're still trying to move forward towards putting in as many as we can, but the costs have increased since this plan was developed. It's a 5-year implementation time frame on this project. We got a project advisory board that was selected by the Water Planning and Policy Center and vetted by EPD. The project area for this is the lower Flint Basin, and specifically in that 2012 suspension area that I mentioned went into effect on July 12th of 2012. Again, no new or increased surface water use and no increased use or new uses in the Florida aquifer. The initial focus of this has been implementing that in the Itchaway-Notchaway Creek subbasin of the Lower Flint, specifically because the Water Planning and Policy Center had done so much work there. Not only is it a ripe area geographically and hydrogeologically, but they had already done a lot of work in that, where their mapping had basically given us a leg up on the information that we had there, and we were able to leverage that information with better use of the funds and a better project. In that project area, there's 370 new Claiborne wells, and the Claiborne aquifer is not a restricted aquifer. It is a deeper aquifer than the Floridan aquifer. The Floridan is more shallow, and it is typically more productive. It is off limits. The Claiborne aquifer is something that new applicants currently do have the opportunity to put in. As I said, it does cost them more to get these wells, but it is an option for current users in the Flint Basin. There's going to be 16 monitoring wells installed. Those monitoring wells are going to collect geologic, hydrologic information, as well as water chemistry information, and all of that data is going to assist us in better understanding and managing the water resources in that basin, as well as the aquifer withdrawal capacities that exist, and how that plays into the regional water capacities. Outside of that basin, we also, we share that aquifer with Florida and Alabama, and that's not just confined to that area. So it's spread out, and we all have drinks in that. We all have straws in that drink, but we need time to better understand how all that plays, how all that localized impact and it spreads out, and what type of regional impacts it may have. Monitoring equipment is going to be installed in those monitoring wells, and those, that work is soon to begin. The contractors are being put together, and information being put together for them to go out and begin that as we speak. We definitely need more information on the deeper aquifers in that project area. Like I said, they're more expensive to drill to the Claiborne aquifer, and the yield is not as much as it would be in the Floridan. But we do have limited data in that area, in the project area. So it's very difficult sometimes when whether a well driller calls or an applicant to put something in, calls and says, hey, I want to put in some well and grow blueberries or whatever you want to grow. And they say, how much water can I get there? Well, we don't know. And we can't promise you anything other than the fact that you'll probably spend a lot of money getting your answer. And that's about the best we can do until we get more data, and that data is going to come from this project, and it's going to come from those monitoring wells in that area. Geology and aquifer characteristics by a team of University of Georgia professors working with us. They're improving the workforce readiness for our project and supporting student training on some of this stuff, and we have undergraduate groundwater technicians working on some of the stuff, and as well as some graduate groundwater professionals working on as well. So it's not just a EPD working on that. We have some really broad perspectives and some very hydrologically inclined experts working on this project. The long-term monitoring of hydrologic effects of reducing surface water withdrawals during droughts is what we're trying to do, and those targeted outcomes of this project include 50 cubic feet per second or more flow benefit during drought. And I want to talk about a flow benefit for just a second, because you might hear that term from your constituents. We hear it from those we want to, we talk about it with those that want new withdrawals, but something that we're looking at in this system is what type of flow benefits we get from different management activities. And by flow benefits, I just simply mean how much flow, how much water can we keep in the stream? How much can we keep in for the critters? How much can we keep in for the flow of that hydrologic system? How much flow do we keep in there for all of the users? And how do we continue to protect those that currently already have a permit to use? Again, getting improved data on those deep aquifers. We're going to have 2 augmentation systems operating in Spring Creek. We currently have one that was damaged some time ago by Hurricane Michael, and that was put in to wet the mussels during dry periods. We're going to have 2. The one that was existing was damaged during Hurricane Michael. This project is going to get that back up and running and get it operational, as well as get another well put in so that it can dump into the creek to ensure species protection. Habitat conservation plan is another goal of this project. The habitat conservation is something that EPD is providing technical support on to the Water Policy Center. And we believe that through the habitat conservation plan that the future of future permitting Florida and aquifer surface waters in the Flint basins, that the habitat conservation plan may offer a good opportunity for a vehicle for the state to in the future have some potential to open up some of those areas that may be restricted now. Doing an updated survey on freshwater mussels in that region, and having improved demand management like conservation easements and suspension incentives, is something that's being looked at as well. Source water conversion, I talked about, converting some of these surface water sources to groundwater, and that being a cost share program, but that source conversion will decrease the adverse impacts on stream flows and during periods of drought. It's going to provide farmers with more reliable sources of water, and it's going to leave water in the rivers and streams and for downstream users and aquatic ecosystems, recreational opportunities, and other water quality protection. It's also going to improve the resilience of the regional economy to potential shocks from the drought and the decrease in its exposure to conflict and the litigation that we have faced in the past, which have been fortunate to have favored outcomes, and a lot of those favored outcomes in that litigation is due to the management activities that the state had implemented. There's going to be more metering. Water use metering under this project, going to ensure that the proper use of these sources are used at different times, that being whether it's the normal periods of climate or drought periods, to make sure that these users are in compliance and make sure that the existing users are protected and their infrastructure is not impacted by any of these changes in any of these source swaps. We're going to have data that's supported for future analysis of resource utilization and sustainability, and also moving towards telemetry meters. So right now we use micrometer propeller meters, and what that means is they have an opportunity to break and get damaged and get sediment in them, and all kinds of stuff goes through them, but at the end of the day it means that I got to send somebody out there to walk up to the meter and actually look at it and look at the number. The telemetry is going to be much more efficient. It's going to save us from having to send people out to these things and all these sites and running around and actually be able to read it just through a data download. We do a data download and not have to send physical presence on people's land like we have to do now. So just moving into better technology. And that'll help us with compliance and understanding compliance better, and also be able to help us to have a better understanding of farm operations on some of these farms that are using this telemetry, and work with these landowners to meet their needs and their questions. Mr. Chairman, that's all I had prepared. If anyone has questions.
Yes, sir. Senator Watson, what number are you? Okay, we got lighting up. We got two of them lighting up here. All right, Senator, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here, Cliff. Appreciate all the work y'all are doing, and I know we've got a lot going on down there, but we've I guess also not had a lot going on. I know the moratorium has been in existence now for almost 11 years. And I know 11 years ago it was told that we would evaluate it annually. Is that still done? When is it evaluated? And if it's evaluated, where's the information on that?
So the original announcement and intent was to have an annual November review of our information. I think that our technology, our information, better resources that we have has really increased what we know over the last 10 years. We've had a major influx of information. Our modeling tools are pretty amazing. We have incredible experts that are doing these things, and to say that we evaluate every November, we wouldn't be doing it justice. We do evaluate it probably, I know you can't geologically evaluate something every month, but we look at this information constantly, and we talk about it constantly. And we talk about what are we doing right, what are we not doing, what do we need to pay attention to. And I certainly wish we do the best we can. We could probably do a lot of things better, I'm sure. We never have enough time and people and all that, like everybody else, to do exactly like we want to do it. But that's how we put our heads together all the time, internal, try to do the best we can with speaking to stakeholders, increasing those discussions, talking with people who may want to put in an application, but like I said, we can't take an application because of the moratorium. What is it that you need? What is it you're trying to do? Are there opportunities to redesign systems or look at new operational efficiencies that maybe we're not looking at? So that's kind of what we're trying to move into, is to talk to some new people about, hey, what are some new things that maybe, what have we missed? Is there anything we need to look at? But we're continuously looking at that, even though the formal announcement back in July 30th of 2012 on the implementation, that moratorium said it was in November. But that information rests in a number of different places. I have, some with our ag permitting program, and we work with our hydrologic unit who has information on the models. We have our metering program and our hydrologic unit that also has information on metered water use. So in the watershed protection branch of the division would be where all of that information would be held.
Okay, well, and I know you've got a lot of extra help behind you, but I mean, why did we say we were going to evaluate it, and I just, we've got farmers down there that have waited patiently. Technology has changed; they're a lot more efficient, and we're still just sitting on a moratorium. We've, heard rumors of possibility of opening things up in some areas for different reasons. And then that all of a sudden disappeared, but now we've all of a sudden got a bunch of money, so obviously some things are starting to happen again. But we've got farmers that have wells that may not be permitted, they have acres that may not be registered or set up or in the database, and they just want to be compliant. Everybody knows they're irrigating, and they've been irrigating for 11 years. We just want everybody we need to be collecting that data. I mean, it just makes sense. But we won't let them come into compliance. We still won't let anybody drill. And we're sending out letters to them from the EPD telling them that they need to get in compliance. They don't know how to get into compliance. Some of them can't get into compliance, and it may not be their fault. And it's like, but y'all have new technology. Everybody's been talking about it, but what does it truly mean when we're going to reevaluate the moratorium?
I think one of the things that we've been doing is we've experienced an explosion in that technology with regard to GPS systems and GIS, geographic information systems, and satellite imagery. It's allowing us to see what's going on. It's allowing those that users and permit holders to submit information to us faster. So that's where it all begins, is in those locations, and that's where everything that we do starts. So when we reevaluate the moratorium, we start looking at just how surface water and groundwater are connected to one another in that basin, and that changes based on the year, whether it's drought year or whether it's not. But for the information that we've had and collected over the past decade, I think it's pretty scientifically proven that water is basically the same water once you get into those lower Flint basins. And if you take from over here, it can impact the surface flows. If you take from the groundwater here, if you take from the surface water, it's certainly a one-to-one impact. And I think that one of the things that we have done really well over the last decade during this moratorium period is improve the modeling and improve the data. And so what that is telling us is in the areas that are there new areas? One of the things we're looking at is, are there new areas that maybe that there are capacities that could be tapped in the future? So that's something the APD has been looking at, and some of the modeling results have been positive, with the potential to look at other areas that may have capacities in the Flint Basin to continue to permit. That said, it's more to it than just the hydrology of it, and that being there being some sensitive, 4 federally endangered mussels in that region. most of our permits are from that region. So that region it's a hot spot, and it's very important for us from a hydrologic standpoint, from a farm gate standpoint. It's also important to the existing users that we have to protect, and our downstream neighbors that we have to protect, and also the critters. So there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of variables that have to be looked at, and that's pretty much what we've been doing the past 10 years. So I'd say those modeling results are really, really good, because a few years ago, we didn't have that positivity that we have now. And it's not that we were negative about it, it's just we didn't have the data. We've gotten a lot better over the last 10 years.
All right, Senator, if you don't mind, Senator Sims' light's been blinking since yours was. I'm gonna. You,
I'm waiting. I've changed my question 3 different times since
okay, well, if you don't mind, Senator Eccles' light's been flashing for a while too. Senator Eccles.
Thank you. So I farm in Northeast Georgia, so I don't have these problems, fortunately. But so I'm listening to you say that, you know, you're collecting data. We've set a moratorium. I don't know, because I'm new here, what was the criteria to establish this moratorium? How are we reporting to that? And then also, what is the criteria to lift the moratorium so that we can, you know, make a plan and move forward, not just continue to collect data, because data is great, but what are we doing with the data we're collecting?
Yeah, so what generated that, the moratorium was certainly the evidence that streams are going dry, and they have gone dry, but we've seen them start going drier longer and going drier faster and staying drier longer in that region. And so the models have shown us what that has looked like and what that trend has been over the past few years. And what that showed is there's potential for adverse impacts with the irrigation that is out there, and just really needed to take a look at how are we managing. And that came in the form of Flint River Basin. When we had an original moratorium in 99 to 2006, that was originally lifted with a 2007 Flint River Basin plan, which took all the stuff, the similar situation, what I'm talking about right now, that we collected over those decades, or that decade, approximate decade during the moratorium, put all that into the plan and decided, hey, these are the management practices that we need to implement moving forward. And one of the things we did with this moratorium was any application that was submitted before the implementation date was still processed. So that all of those are still, there's still a few that are still going through that process. So there were still people that came online and came into the system after that. They were people that had applied for it beforehand. But that was really just the adverse impacts, or the potential for adverse impacts in the lower Flint Basin. Because that surface water and groundwater is so close together and so tightly connected, we just needed a better understanding of how the withdrawals that we currently have and any potential future withdrawals may impact that. So that was the genesis of that. You know, the idea of how do we come out of this, I think that we believe that through the work we're doing, the partnership we're doing with the Water Policy Center, Habitat Conservation Plan, and working through that may offer us a future of being able to open up or consider potential withdrawals in that basin in a different way than we have now. So that's what we believe is part of the solution for sure. But definitely just better models, continued talk about what our practices are currently, and if we could improve those, that would be the future for us.
All right. Senator Sims.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your presentation, Mr. Lewis, but I have a lot of questions I won't get a chance to ask this afternoon, but I do want to make an expression. And I want to be respectful of the critters that we have to be mindful of. I want to be respectful of the downstream folks from our farmers and the upstream folks as well. But you know, that water flows downstream too, so there are a lot of users up there just as well as us taking from to irrigate our farms. This is a 12-year moratorium, 12 years. Data collecting, data analysis, those kinds of things. But we are an $80 billion industry. Ag is an $80 billion industry. And once you put those very stringent stipulations on our ag community, then tell me, what are we gonna do? How do you purport or propose for our ag industry to be productive and thrive if they've had a 12-year moratorium and there's no, is there any plans in sight for us to say, and to these individuals that are representing the ag industry here, that we're going to recognize what their situations are right now? What can I tell my farmers in Southwest Georgia?
Yeah, certainly. One of the things I mentioned is EPD's statutory directive to protect existing users. So that $80 million, $80 billion is something that we have to protect, and something that we have to use our management activities and our, the policies that we use to protect that. So that's one thing, is we want to protect that 80 billion. So there's that. Let's preserve that. But we also want to continue to grow, for sure. We just want to make sure that our growth is measured in a way that does not jeopardize those that are producing and do have those permits that are producing that $80 billion. So one of our primary directives is to protect those that currently exist. And part of that protection comes at just being very measured in everything that we do from this point forward. Certainly the sensitivities of that basin with the species there, the 4 protected mussels, and the subject of by and potentially in past tri-state litigation causes us to move very measured. And it's simply to protect those that are currently in the system and protect that farm gate value.
Senator Sims, okay, we'll move on to Senator Watson. His was blinking next. Go ahead, Senator Watson.
Well, I guess wanted to follow up where I left off and kind of ask, I mean, what does the data have to show to decide whether we need to stay in a moratorium or lift a moratorium, or maybe let everybody become compliant that's not compliant, or, something of that measure? Where's it got to be to make that decision, and who makes that decision?
Well, one of the things that I mentioned earlier was flow benefit, and that's something that is going to be getting to Senator Eccles' point. What's the criteria in the future? We're looking at flow benefit. So when you talk about putting extra straws in there, or the straws that are in there, all of that will be in the context of what the flow benefit of that system is and what those models do show. So that's what I would say. That's what it needs to show, is that whatever happens in the future, whether it's additional permits in this area or this pocket or wherever that is, that it doesn't have an adverse impact on the flow benefit. Because in the event that happens, it's going to open us up not just to internal potential farmer uncertainty in the infrastructure and the investments they've made because their neighbors are getting new wells, potentially impacting them, but also our downstream neighbors that we have to consider as well. But flow benefit is something that we've currently holding as a high priority, is something we're looking at in terms of what happens in the future.
Well, and I mean, but again, for the ones that aren't in compliance, if we've been checking the data and the data has not moved a whole lot, and it's staying normal or within whatever this range is that we're supposed to be measuring off of, why don't we just bring everybody into compliance and start collecting the data, the real data, and get our acres matched up with what they're supposed to be, and just bring everybody into the fold?
Well, you hit a good point earlier when you talked about the different, I guess, scenarios that the past 20, 25 years that farmers have had to get water use permits have gone through, and that has changed over time. What you had to apply for, or maybe the application looked different, or what you'd be required to do. But one thing that I've seen over the last 20 years is it's not a blanket non-compliance issue, as to put it in the terms that you talked about. There's a case-by-case scenario almost every time. There are nuances to everybody who is not in compliance. Some didn't know, some knew.
Yeah.
And some, there's all kinds of things, but it's not something that can happen fast, and it takes a long time to work through each of those cases. And one of the things we're doing right now is taking a step back and working through each of those cases on one-on-one, more reaching out to those that, like you mentioned, those that got the letters, to help people understand what compliance is, what it means, how to know what it is. And in some cases, we're going to find some solutions to help people get into compliance. There will be some that that won't be easy choices to make by the growers, the producers, or by EPD, for sure.
If you don't mind, Senator Watson, I want to ask a question real quick. And so where I live at and farm, is from Valdosta to east. So we don't have any water problems over there. Matter of fact, we got too much water most of the time. But my question is, the aquifer that we're talking about, the farmers just across the state line in Alabama and in Florida, they're still drilling wells every day, right?
Correct.
And so and I don't want you to think I'm not trying to beat up on y'all. I just sincerely would like to know. I mean, if we're pumping out the same pond, basically, and the farmers in Alabama and Florida are still able to drill wells, but our farmers aren't. What do you say to that? That's one of the things that, if we were all in the same boat together and all the farmers weren't, but I feel like the farmers in the other two states are pumping out the pond and our farmers aren't able to.
Mr. Chairman, I think what separates us is two things. Number one, we're upstream of Florida, and that matters in federal law. Your upstream has a federal obligation to protect your downstream neighbor, number one. And number two, we got those 4 federally endangered mussels over in that Flint Basin, and they're not over there, where the guys are poking holes in Alabama or Florida that I know about. We do know about them in the Flint Basin, but the fact that they're there draws a lot of attention, Mr. Chairman, and it requires a lot of paying attention to on our part to make sure that we're following the right protocol and moves forward and talking to the right people, just to make sure that we preserve the infrastructure of those that already have those permits in that area.
Senator Burns he's been waiting patiently.
I'm patient, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Appreciate the input. Appreciate the work you do. I want to come back to something maybe that Senator Watson keeps harping on, and that's non-compliant wells. How many are there?
Depending on what area you're in, but
let's just take Georgia.
We've got about 500
about 500, and
active
they're
cases right
mostly
now.
located in
The majority of those will be located in that Flint River Basin area.
Okay,
Now,
so southwest Georgia.
It is, but not all of those. We're talking about some of those are cases where maybe there's just not a meter on. Matter of fact, there's a lot of those. It's just the meter
where
wasn't
they're
working.
permitted, but the meter is not currently
something like that.
providing information.
Or maybe they hadn't turned in all the information. There's a good load of those too. But
Okay.
But the hard ones, Senator Burns, are the ones that your permits for 100 acres and you're irrigating 200
Sure.
acres, and we don't have any extra acres to give, or we're not taking applications to modify acres. There's those, and then there's those that after 2012, you got those that did put in, that we can see by that imagery, as Senator Watson mentioned, they've been pumping forever. We can see that. We can also see the ones that put it in, in 2013 when they came in 2012 and asked could they have it, and we said no. And they put that in anyway. So we got those too. We got it's not one category, it's a broad category. That's what I meant to get at is it's just a case by case basis that we're having to go through things, and they take a while.
And I appreciate that.
Yes,
But I would say to Senator Watson's point, we need to document those things effectively, so at least we have that data as a part of the utilization data set. I want to shift over to East Georgia, Southeast Georgia, which is where I farm and I'm a piddler. I'm not a real farmer. I want you to know these guys are real farmers. My grandfather was a farmer, but he had two mules, so it was a bit different back then. But I have Burke County, which is one of the largest producing cotton peanut counties in the state, and Scriven County and Bullock County and a host of others, Emmanuel County, and that down the Savannah River, the Ogeechee, the Altamaha, and we draw water from the Floridian aquifer, okay? And we poke holes down there and we irrigate crops. But we're also experiencing some significant growth from an industrial perspective and from a residential perspective. How does that fit into EPD's water management plan?
Well, with regard to agriculture, EPD doesn't have the authority to consider a residential neighborhood whenever you apply for an ag well. So that's not something we notice where some of those are, and from a common sense perspective, we might take a look and see how that's impacted, but that can't, that's not necessarily a factor in the decision to give you what you're asking for ag purposes.
So my concern is, long-time generational agricultural producers in southeast Bullock County are likely will be impacted by the industrial growth in that region. How do we protect them? How do we ensure that they can continue to farm and that the water supply will continue to support their operations?
Cliff, let me take.
Want to try that one?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Mr. Chairman,
What do I do when I go back and talk to those guys?
I'm Breck Dunn. I'm the director of EPD, and I came up here to try to address some of Senator Watson's concerns, but particularly on East Georgia. There's a little different concern on the coast, and that deals with saltwater intrusion
Saltwater intrusion.
and the amount of groundwater pumping.
Yep.
And I think the future to accommodate the growth and the future water use in the coastal region of Georgia is going to be more use of surface water.
Surface water.
Yes, sir.
There's not a lake south.
There's the
of
Savannah
Augusta,
River, right.
South of Augusta, Georgia.
Right.
And that Savannah comes down, and we've got 2 or 3 lakes above. So there's very limited surface water in
Right.
southeast Georgia.
Right.
We got a lot of ocean out there.
Mm-hmm.
That's
But
the only surface.
in particular, meeting particularly not so much the farming needs, because again, farm use is not a huge use out there, but the municipal industrial growth in that area.
And by the way, we certainly support that.
Yes.
We certainly support that industrial growth and that residential
Right.
growth, not only in my region, but also across our state. But it does impact our agricultural industry substantially.
Absolutely. And again, the concern there is the groundwater pumping and what it does to the saltwater plume. Hilton Head has issues with saltwater intrusion related to pumping in Georgia. So the future there for growth is going to be getting surface water to where.
Surface water.
Yes, sir.
And as a bass fisherman, I think that's a great idea. I just need more surface to fish in.
Correct.
They, if y'all don't mind, Senator, I'm gonna, Senator Sims' light has been blinking for a while. Senator Sims,
Question number 1 or 2 or 3. Is the lower Flint aquifer or basin the only one on the moratorium?
That's currently the only one that's under an agricultural moratorium, yes, ma'am.
And is it not true that we're downstream from what you just finished talking about, Senator? Growth, industrial growth, residential growth. Does that have any effect on the our ag world in Southwest Georgia?
I think one of the biggest differences in the way to answer that is the fact that municipal or industrial withdrawals put back about 80% of whatever they withdraw, and agricultural withdrawals are considered 100% consumptive. Therefore,
We don't put anything back.
they don't. Well, it's arguable. I don't know if I don't know if we put 99% back or if we put 45% back. Something may go back, but the studies have not been done to show that. So that's an area of some information gap. Exactly what is the percentage that is put back into the system, and until that's known, that's the models that are used would use 100%. Talking with ag experts in the region of Flint, though, and you're from there too. The hottest times of the year. You know what it's like down there, and water is not available a lot of times. Surface water is not available a lot of times. So, the idea that agricultural water use is 100% consumptive, in a lot of these ag experts' minds, is that it's pretty close, if I can say that.
The analyses that you guys have been doing during the moratorium, what do they reflect? Are there answers to this? way to a lag reduction?
Absolutely, increase and something we're working with is just increasing low pressure on the systems that are out there. Considering new technologies such as variable rate irrigation to turn water off on non-cropped areas. Looking at certain drought conditions that allow use under certain conditions, but cease irrigation under other conditions. That's another practice. But in some cases, when you don't have anything, that might be better than nothing.
I'm confused when you said you don't have anything.
Well, if you don't have a permit and you asked for a certain, let's say, rate or a certain amount of acres, maybe we can't give you that, but we can give you something. It may not be everything you asked for, but some of those practices might be that we, working with that individual, say, hey, we can't give it to you. We can't give you that 1,000 gallon per minute well here. Is there any way you can move it over here? Because we think you could be all right here. And so just working with people on placement, as well as size and some of the design. And unfortunately, in some of those cases, we're just in very sensitive areas with the mussels, and also in areas where the surface and groundwater is basically the same water. It is the same water. So just various types of conservation conditions that we could do, potentially seasonality uses of permitted water use, are just things that we're looking at. Technology.
I was an appointee to the Water Commission years ago, so, we're concerned, and I'm knowledgeable of the mussels, we have to be mindful of, and other things. But a 12-year moratorium, is it not 12 years?
It's actually, some areas of the lower Flint, it's been since 1999. So.
Do we have a new protocol? Do we have something to help our farmers with their requests?
So, if Senator Sims, if I could kind of combine this into some of the angles that Senator Watson was getting at when he was asking about the moratorium. And we've been patiently waiting for the moratorium, and we're supposed to review every year, and what do we do, and things like that. I wanted to come up and just kind of emphasize the point, particularly for the last 5 years, we've been very limited on what we can do with the moratorium due to the Tri-State Water Wars litigation, and we certainly didn't want to modify the moratorium while we were undergoing that litigation. That litigation, that particular case, has been largely resolved in our favor. And of course, the first thing we ask is, in what ways can we responsibly modify the moratorium? Are there areas, Cliff talked about, the groundwater, surface water interaction, are there areas that are currently covered by the moratorium where, additional withdrawals may not have such an impact on surface water flows? And looking at that, are there ways, again, the whole sub-area 4 is kind of a blanket. No new groundwater withdrawals from the Florida aquifer, no new surface waters. And again, looking at there's ways we can responsibly modify that at the edges to allow additional withdrawals. And we've looked at that very carefully, and I think what we've decided as a policy matter is to hold back on modifying the moratorium at this point to allow the exploration of habitat conservation plans, incidental take permits, explore that process if that's something we want to pursue. And if that's something we want to pursue, we want to align those two processes together. So, Senator, I was trying to respond to some of your questions about, we're patiently waiting, and that's kind of where we are right now. Does that make sense? Okay.
So, but what about all the people that aren't in compliance?
Yeah, that's a harder question. Mm-hmm.
They've been irrigating,
I
and
know.
they keep irrigating.
Right.
What difference does it make at this point? And why don't we collect the data so that we have the accurate information, so that if somebody tries to do something later on, we have the accurate data and we're telling the truth. Right now, we're not telling the truth. We're telling them false information because we don't have all the data. And, Cliff's sending letters and having to deal with them on an individual basis. And I know there's instances where they can work some of it out, but there's some of them they just can't, and it's not their fault. They bought a piece of property that they didn't know. They weren't told, and farming's changed, and everybody's trying to be more efficient, and the equipment's more efficient, and obviously we've been collecting the data. You know, and we get the calls with these people with these letters, you know, from the farmers, from the well drillers, from everybody, and we have nothing to tell them except we're going to wait on somebody one day, maybe in their lifetime, to reevaluate this, when that's what everybody said 11 years ago. And I guess to go ahead, Cliff's mentioned it and you mentioned it, this Habitat Conservation Plan, I don't know anything about it. And I'm a farmer in Southwest Georgia, and I've been a legislator for 10 years, and I don't know anything about it. You can't even find it, you can't even Google it and find anything on it.
Cliff, you want to talk about HCP? And I think we've got some other
Yeah,
folks
I'd
here. who
love,
can talk
love
about
to
it. Mhm.
learn about it, and, I mean,
Well, actually, I think Anya
it's,
was prepared
and
to
it's,
do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
and why are we waiting till now? Why didn't we go down this road right after we went into the moratorium?
Mhm.
Hello, my name is Anya Troszczynski. I'm the chief of the Watershed Protection Branch, and I'll give you maybe a little bit of history about the Habitat Conservation Plan, if that's okay. So this is a conversation that has actually started many years ago. It's been kind of bubbling off and on, and so there's been a lot more conversation about it in some points in time, a little bit less in others. This is something that folks have been thinking about pretty much since the Fish and Wildlife Service back in 1998 identified those 4 endangered mussels and 1 threatened mussel species. But it really kicked off after EPD developed the Flint River Basin Plan. This was the plan that Cliff mentioned, finalized in 2006. One of the comments that we received from the Fish and Wildlife Service at that time was that if we implemented the plan as written, it would basically be considered, or it could be considered, a violation of the Endangered Species Act. Basically, we could be having an incidental taking. This means that we would somehow harm or in other ways negatively affect one of those threatened and endangered species. So when you're in that kind of situation, you can either modify what you are doing in a fairly significant way, or you can work through a process called an incidental take permit. This is one of the components of the Endangered Species Act. An incidental take permit says you could be doing otherwise lawful activities that may result in some taking of an endangered species, but you're going to also do whatever you can to minimize or mitigate for that impact. And the way that you describe how you minimize and mitigate is through the development of a habitat conservation plan that basically outlines all of the strategy, all of the funding, all of the folks who are responsible. And then you do some monitoring, Fish and Wildlife does some monitoring, and they confirm, are you really doing something beneficial for these species? And the Habitat Conservation Plan first kind of came on the radar in that documented way back in 2006. We received additional comments from Fish and Wildlife as we went through the regional water planning process. Back in 2008, we received letters. Back in 2010, we received letters. So this has been something that's been kind of simmering within our horizon, I guess, for a while. But these kinds of plans are challenging to make. We have one successful one in Georgia for the red cockaded woodpecker that is held by WRD, Wildlife Resources Division. There was also an attempt to have one up in the Coosa Basin to help protect some of the darters that are up there. But due to a lack of an established funding mechanism, lack of ability to get all of the plan components together, that actually fell apart. So it takes years to develop these types of plans. The Habitat Conservation Plan, there's nothing right now developed for it, but it is a component of the ARPA project that Cliff described earlier. Because as we're going through everything and looking at what we've got, it looks like a viable option for us to develop an effective permitting strategy that would address the concerns that you're mentioning. So it would allow us to address liability, both for the farmers themselves as well as for the state of Georgia. If we were to open up permitting right now, there's some concern, of course, that we could be subject to litigation or some other legal liability risk that we are performing that taking. It also allows us to build a more robust HCP to maintain that moratorium. That might be secondary. But another thing is that it does allow us to bring in all of these tools, right? Cliff was explaining the very complicated series of decisions and series of tools that we have available to manage agricultural water withdrawal permitting in the Flint River Basin. And the HCP allows us to take all of that together, put it under one big umbrella and say, we're not going to have this piecemeal approach. We're going to have something comprehensive, something clear, something that we have a lot of stakeholder buy-in for to really move this forward. Because the farmers in that region have been subject to a whole lot. There were no permits until 1988. Then in 1999, there was the first moratorium that was put in place until 2006. Then we issued permits in compliance with the 2006 Flint River Basin Plan. That lasted until the moratorium that was enacted in 2012. So there's a lot of back and forth. We want to make sure that we have regulatory certainty. We also want to be really sure and really clear about where we have capacity within our water resources.
Can I ask a
Yes, sir.
question? So, Senator Sims' district, you have a farmer that owns land in Quitman County, Georgia.
Mhm.
He can't drill a well. Right across the border in Eufaula, that farmer can drill a well. They're pumping the same water. That's what I can't wrap my mind around. I know that we're talking about downstream, but we're talking about east and west here. This sitting north and south. You know what I'm saying?
Yes, sir.
I mean, what do we say to these farmers? Because that's the one thing I would say, and I want y'all to understand that, especially these senators to the right of me are under a tremendous amount of pressure from their farmers down there, and you know, so you know this is a big issue for them, and so do you understand where? I understand what you're saying about being downstream, but this isn't downstream.
No, and I understand. I believe I understand the question. I think that you've hit on something that Director Dunn touched on, and that is what we're exploring, because there are places, especially as you start moving out to the fringe of Subarea 4, where we see that the groundwater and the surface water just isn't as closely connected. So there are some places where if you put in another well, we're not going to see a lot of effect on the surface water flows. But we want to be able to really understand that hydrology and kind of put that all together so that we are establishing a very clear permitting process. So we do think that there are areas, and I don't know, I can't speak specifically to equipment, but I know that there are areas within Subarea 4 where there may be some additional capacity without necessarily hurting those mussels. But that's something that we want to look at and evaluate with all of the tools that are at our disposal. I know that's not necessarily a tomorrow answer, but we do recognize that there is that variability.
Oh, thank you,
Just to follow up
Senator
on
Watson.
So I've not heard about an HCP until recent. So if we wouldn't have got the ARPA funds, would we be talking about HCP? And then on top of that, we just won a Supreme Court case, and now we're basically gonna say that farmers are taking a species, or admitting to taking a species after we just told the whole world that we're not doing anything wrong. I don't understand that concept.
Yeah, and I think one thing to clarify, and I apologize if I misspoke or was not particularly clear, with the incidental take permit, you're not necessarily admitting to a taking. What you are doing is you're protecting yourself in case someone were to make that allegation or in case there happened to be a taking. So that it's more of a protective thing than it is an admission of any sort of guilt or anything like that. And I'm so sorry, I forgot the very first part of the question.
The money. So
The
we're,
money,
we're all
yes,
of a
sir.
sudden got some money, and so now we're talking HCP or whatever that is, and we're moving forward with it. And I don't even know how long that takes. How long does it take? So are we talking another 2 years, another 5 years before we can even answer these farmers?
Absolutely. So, and if I forget one of the questions, please remind me. But the money was a big part because those deeper wells are going to be very helpful in terms of protecting flows and creating additional, basically creating additional flow, being really protective of the mussels. That was a big thing. And that helped move things along much more quickly. But that conversation about the HCP was something that had been generally discussed for longer than that. So I don't know that the ARPA funds necessarily resulted in a change in process, but the ARPA funds, I think, certainly made available more options and on a quicker time frame. Because to your second point, we don't want folks waiting another decade before they can do anything. I understand that there are real challenges that are faced by constituents in both of the districts, and so we want to be responsive. The big thing is we want to move quickly, but we don't want to hurry. We don't want to mess this up. So typically, the development of an HCP can take anywhere from about 18 months to, I would say, 24 months, 27 or so. We would be looking at having submitted something to U.S. Fish and Wildlife, if that is, sort of the direction that we go. In that general time frame, Fish and Wildlife tends to take 6 to 18 months to approve. There are ongoing discussions to see, is there anything in this process that we can speed up? Is there something that we can do concurrent with Fish and Wildlife's review, or things we can do on the front end? because we certainly understand that there is a level of urgency there.
So why is this not, does this not have to be in statute or passed through the legislature?
The incidental take permit?
The general concept of HCP and making that decision for
We did,
the farmers of the state of Georgia.
that was not the process that was completed with the 2000 HCP for the red cockaded woodpecker. So my understanding is that that is not the standard process. We do understand that this affects a lot of stakeholders, and that is why this is a very stakeholder-driven process with a lot of conversations, a lot of folks at the table, because EPD would not be in the best position to make decisions for farmers. We are in a good position to make decisions with farmers.
I didn't know about it.
Okay.
Just,
Senator Sims, did you have? No. Hold on. Sam, hold on just a minute. I'm sorry, Senator Watson, you go ahead.
The compliance, we've been collecting the data. We know what it is. They're pumping, they're gonna keep pumping. Why can't we at least bring everybody into compliance?
Yeah, it's Senator Watson, it's an extremely hard issue. I don't want to set up a regime where the best way for you to be able to irrigate your fields is just to go out and do it. And then EPD will excuse and bring it in. So we have to find a way, I think, responsibly in a way that works. And again, as Cliff mentioned, a lot of this is on the ground. Are there other permits that we can, that you may possess that we can modify, maybe take some acres off over here to allow things like that? It's just a very tough issue. Just to say, that's okay, everyone, come on in.
Senator Watson, Judd Turner is in the audience. Mr. Turner, would you mind? I understand you were the director when the moratorium was issued. Would you mind coming forward? Do you have anything that you would like to share?
Hey man, how are you? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, sir. It's been a good discussion, and I appreciate you, Senator Watson, your questions and yours, Mr. Chairman. I'll just say a couple of things about where we were when I was director, which I took that job on January 1 of 2012, and we did this moratorium again in the summer, and it was the second year of what would be a historic drought for Southwest Georgia. I mean, we talk about 1954 as the drought of record for 1 year, but if you look at the back-to-back nature of 11 and 12, we consider that the drought of record. So I'm from Albany originally and have family over in Arlington and Calhoun County. And I know my dad was driving down Highway 62 and called me in that office over there and said, "Hey, I just drove over Itchway-Notchway Creek and I've never seen it that low." And I went down the hall and talked to one of our guys and said, "Hey, what's the gauge at Milford show? This is the winter, right? This isn't the summer." And it was 4 CFS flow. And the drought of record in 1954, before we had a lot of irrigation, it was 120 CFS. Now, we're in the middle of litigation with Florida, but I want to make this point really clear. If Georgia's, and this gets to your question, Mr. Chairman, if Georgia's state lines went all the way to the Mississippi River and all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, we should still be doing a habitat conservation plan, and we should have still said time out on new wells to get our hands around this, because the 4 CFS at Milford should scare. I understand there are federal muscles at issue, but that should be a challenge and a problem for all active farms in the region. That's not a secure source of water, and we got a lot of surface water irrigation guys. And so that's how it started. And yes, it's taken a long time, and I don't have all the metrics about how to get there. I do think this, though, about the habitat conservation plan, Senator. We did do 2 versions of a planning grant from Fish and Wildlife for habitat conservation planning in about 2012 and 2013, where we were looking at feasibility. A lot of other things were going on, and we were coming out of the drought, and we got some good mussel data during that point, and we were thinking about that. And it's easy to go on Fish and Wildlife's website and sort of look at a habitat conservation plan in a vacuum and think, well, wait a minute, how does this work with what we're trying to do, and how would the moratorium work? But I see it. And in full disclosure, I'm working with the Water Center on this project. Really, my role is, if we get around to a habitat conservation plan, we put something together and we're going to present it to Fish and Wildlife. That's going to be a lot of the work I do. But, Senator, you ask about, well, wait a minute, when does this, at what point do we cross a line where this body should be weighing in on water policy? And I mean, my answer to that is, it kind of depends on what's in the plan. There are habitat conservation plans that are quite small that are approved by Fish and Wildlife, where two landowners get together at just two of them and decide to do something voluntary, and it helps a critter population, and Fish and Wildlife approves it. You know, that's not what we're talking about here. What we think we have the potential to do here. And again, what the federal money did with ARPA is it let the state do something we've been talking about, knowing we needed to do. Back to Cliff's point about stream flow benefits or flow benefits. We've kind of known one of the best things we could do is do this source switching during a drought from surface water to groundwater. And so, to defend EPD for a second, the ability to adjust the moratorium, not just in a very limited way based on the data we have now, but in a much more comprehensive way when we consider not just can we afford to put 2 more straws in this acreage right here, but if we're moving these guys down, getting that benefit from stream flow, if we're looking at these other management practices, if we're revitalizing the Flint River Drought Protection Act so it works and folks can voluntarily withdraw, suspend irrigation during droughts, and the auction function is working, when all of that's in a plan. And I can't tell you, there's no plan in the drawer anybody's hiding. You've got to go through the stakeholder process that Anya just talked about. But in that process, if there could be 10 different plans we could all have on the table, and they all aren't equal. I mean, some of them are going to cost more, some of them are going to have more benefit in the river. But for the folks that have been working on this for a long time, and really the way the Habitat Conservation Plan got re-kicked off, because we've talked about it over these years, but the lady, I'll put President McCall on the spot. When he was Chairman McCall and Chairman Wilkinson in the Senate, they, in 2017, so we're in the middle of the end of the litigation, where they had a joint ag committee meeting in Perry, and all the directors but one were invited, and we all talked about this issue. We had this conversation in 2017, and the takeaway was we really ought to get back on this HCP, because it's the vehicle to look at all this stuff, so that when we open back up to the extent we know we can't just say, remember 4 CFS in 2012. If we have another 2012, 4 CFS at Milford. That's what's going to happen without adding new irrigation. So the problem is, how do we get to add some new but also protect the sustainability of what we got and protect these critters because they present a risk? So back to the point about what's Alabama and Florida doing. If their critters get in the way, they could have trouble, but right now they don't have that problem that we have. So that's why we got to kind of do this if we're smart. At the same time, if we do it under this umbrella of this HCP, it's open stakeholder process. It's going to take us a while to model all this stuff, but the bricks are laying around in the yard. We got more data for an HCP than probably any state in the country. So I'm real bullish that this is going to work. But if there's something that changes that needs to be implemented, that requires a change in law or policy, it would require coming back here. So it kind of depends. To answer your question, sir, it kind of depends. But I know this HCP cannot be fully understood. Listen, when I was director, EPD was, you know, WRD had that planning grant in 2012, and so my cousins inside the DNR family really were the grant recipients, and EPD was participating as the regulatory authority for ag. But now we've got, because of the ARPA grant, we just have this opportunity. But to answer your question, if we didn't have the ARPA money, there'd be several of us still saying, based on 2017, this is what we need to do. And I think Farm Bureau, who've been real educated on this, and these guys can, I don't want to speak for them, but I'll tee it up. I mean, they have a policy that really has looked at this and said within the moratorium, we ought to look at the moratorium adjustment. We ought to do it inside an HCP. And Mr. President, I don't want to speak for you on that, but I think that's accurate on the way you're. Yes, sir. So, Mr. Chairman, thanks for the recognition, but I blathered on. But any questions or anything, I'm happy to try to answer.
Any member of the committee want to ask? Senator Watson.
So if it's such a great plan, why were we not asking for the money earlier?
We kind of did, not from the state money, because we did have, we just took the time to, I mean, the tri-state litigation caused us to pause a lot of work. But we immediately were trying to work on a habitat conservation planning through the Fish and Wildlife starting last year, the minute we could. And then the ARPA money was there, and that was really a governor's office conversation that kind of came along.
So why is there not more education about this subject on y'all's water policy website or EPD's website?
I think that is
Farm Bureau's website or somebody's website
well, I think,
where people can
yes, sir.
understand what's going on.
I think that's a great takeaway. I mean, I won't speak for EPD, but on the water policy side, the Georgia Fit website really talks more about the ARPA funding to move folks down, and I think we need to move up some of the
I've been on
HCP.
It doesn't mention
Right.
HCP. Either,
I
but
think
it
that
talks
needs to
about money.
happen. EPD can
We'll
talk
get
about
something
theirs.
up there, Senator.
And then Farm Bureau, I do think you guys have got a fair bit of material on HCP. I mean, it may not be front page of your site, so, but we all can, I think, take that advice that we really need to elevate that publicly available information for sure.
Okay. Any other questions from members of the committee? I know the hour's getting late. Thank y'all for coming today. Thank you for taking time to talk with us. I've certainly learned a lot. Had a lot of discussion. I will say this though, and obviously, I'm a farmer and not a water specialist, but or a geologist. But I would say this: the way things stand today, I would sure hate to know that my granddaddy bought his farm in Quitman County, Georgia, and instead of buying it right across the line in Eufaula, Alabama, in terms of property values and what it means for being able to utilize the resources under the ground. That's one of the things that I'm having a hard time wrapping my brain around. But I do appreciate what you do, and I appreciate that I certainly don't understand what all you do. But I do think that, to Senator Watson's point, I think it would be very helpful to them and their job that they do in representing their constituency to get some more information out to these folks so that they can see that maybe y'all are going to land this plane at some point, honestly, because I can tell you I don't even represent their district, but just as serving as a chairman of this committee and being a farmer myself, the amount of texts and phone calls that you get from folks in that part of the world, and I'm sure you all deal with that yourselves. But
I'm a popular guy down there.
Yeah. So we do appreciate it. I know we've taken an hour and 15 minutes of your time. Thank you for coming in. We appreciate it. Wait a minute. We have.
Say one thing. Apologize for
Go.
was it the Health and Human Services?
Go ahead,
question?
Senator Hatchett.
This is the first time I've had a former law professor testify in front of a committee that I'm on. He taught me water law at UGA.
Yeah, we should talk more about this, shouldn't we?
Well, I will tell you, I am not an attorney, but I did watch a lot of Matlock when I was growing up. But thank y'all for being here.
Thank you, Mr.
I
Chairman.
appreciate your time with that. This meeting is adjourned.